Hello, my dear students. Wishing you a good day. I welcome you all to today's English class. Today, let us study the new prose, The Portrait of a Lady, written by Khushwant Singh. Before we start, let's have the introduction of the lesson. The Portrait of a Lady is a story of the author. He describes his relationship with his grandmother over the years. He pens down her daily activities and how she evolved as a character as time passed by. He explains her appearance, which helps create an image in the reader's mind. About the author, Khushwant Singh was born on 2nd of February 1915. He is an Indian author, lawyer, diplomat, journalist, and politician. His experience in the 1947 partition of India inspired him to write Train to Pakistan in 1956, which became his most well-known novel. He has won the Padma Bhushan, Padma Vibhushan, and Punjab Ratna Award. Let's start the prose, The Portrait of a Lady, written by Khushwant Singh. My grandmother, like everybody's grandmother, was an old woman. She had been old and wrinkled for the 20 years that I had known her. People said that she had once been young and pretty and had even had a husband, but that was hard to believe. My grandfather's portrait hung above the mantelpiece in the drawing room. Here, the author talks about his grandmother. So he says, my grandmother, like everybody's grandmother, was an old woman. Here he says, his grandmother is like everybody's grandmother. How? How was she? She was an old woman. She had been old and wrinkled for the 20 years that I had known her. So here he says she had been old and wrinkled. Wrinkled means having small lines on the face because of old age. And he had seen this for the 20 years. People said that she had once been young and pretty and even had a husband, but that was hard to believe. Okay, people said him that she had once been young and pretty and even had a husband, but that was hard to believe. To whom? To Khushwant Singh, the author Khushwant Singh. That was unbelievable. My grandfather's portrait hung above the mantelpiece in the drawing room. Here the author says my grandfather's portrait. What is portrait? Is nothing but a painting or a drawing or a photograph. So here his grandfather's portrait hung above the mantelpiece. So children, mantelpiece is nothing but a structure of wood, marble or stone above and around a fireplace. He wore a big turban and loose-fitting clothes. His long white beard covered the best part of his chest and he looked at least 100 years old. He did not look the sort of person who would have a wife or children. He looked as if he could have lots and lots of grandchildren. As for my grandmother, being young and pretty, the thought was almost revolting. So he wore a big turban. Here he refers to the author's grandfather. The author's grandfather. So he wore a big turban. Turban is nothing but a man's head covering consisting of a long length of material. Okay, especially worn by Sikhs. Okay, so the people who belong to Sikh, okay, men people used to wear this turban. So he wore a big turban and loose fitting clothes. How were his clothes? Loose fitting. His long white beard covered the best part of his chest. Covered the best part. So his white beard used to cover his chest, and he looked at least 100 years old. So how he was looking in the portrait? He was looking at least 100 years old person. He did not look the sort of person who would have a wife or children. So when by seeing the portrait of his grandfather, he imagined he was not looking like a person. He was not that kind of person who would have wife or children. How he was looking then? He looked as if he could have lots and lots of grandchildren. As for my grandmother being young and pretty, the thought was almost revolting. So, as for my grandmother, so he is remembering what people told about his grandmother. They told him that once in her age she was young and pretty. So this thought was almost revolting, disgusting, unpleasant to hear. She often told us of the games she used to play as a child that seemed quite absurd and undignified on her part, as we treated it like the fables of the prophets. She used to tell us she had always been short and fat and slightly bent. Her face was crisscross of wrinkles running from everywhere to everywhere. No, we were certain she had always been as we had known her. She often told us of the games. Here she refers to the grandmother of the author. She often, every now and then, she used to narrate the games that she used to play as a child to her grandson, the author, that seemed quite and absurd. Absurd means like unreasonable and undignified. Okay? Which used to look like as disrespectful, like appearing foolishness. Okay, that seemed quite absurd and undignified on her part, as we treated it like the fables. Fables means they thought she is not the author. He thought that she is not saying the truth, in the sense it seemed like she is narrating a story of the prophets she used to tell to us. Like the saints, like how the saints used to narrate the stories, like that. She used to narrate her childhood incidents. She had always been short and fat and slightly bent. How was her appearance? How she was looking? She was always been short and fat and slightly bent. Her face was crisscross of wrinkles running from everywhere to everywhere. Okay? Crisscross. Crisscross means a pattern of intersecting straight lines from here and there. Okay? From everywhere. So, no, we were certain she had always been as we had known her. So here the author says, no, we are certain, we are sure she had always been as we had known her. How old, so terribly old that she could not have grown older and had stayed at the same age for 20 years. She could never have been pretty, but she was always beautiful. She hobbled about the house in spotless white, with one hand resting on her waist to balance her stoop and the other telling the beads of her rosary. So she was very old, so terribly old that she could not have grown older. She was too old. Apart from that, she could not have grown older of being in the present situation, and had stayed at the same age for 20 years. So, since for 20 years she had been old. She could never have been pretty, but she was always beautiful. So here she could not have been pretty, but she was always beautiful. She hobbled about the house in spotless. She hobbled means she used to move here and there, walk in an awkward way in the house. She used to walk in an awkward way in the house in spotless white. Spotless white means pure white with one hand, pure white clothes with one hand resting on her waist. Resting on her waist to balance her stoop, to balance her bent. As she was bent, slightly bent, in order to balance, she used to keep one hand on her waist and the other telling the beads of her rosary. So she used to say rosary, the prayers, very silently. Her silver locks were scattered untidily over her pale, puckered face, and her lips constantly moved in inaudible prayer. Yes, she was beautiful. She was like the winter landscape in the mountains, an expanse of pure white serenity, breathing peace and contentment. My grandmother and I were good friends. My parents left me with her when they went to live in the city, and we were constantly together. Her silver locks. Here, silver locks refers to the grandma's curly white hairs were scattered. Scattered means disorganized, untidily, not even neat. Okay, over her pale, puckered face. Pale, puckered face means wrinkled face, and her lips constantly moved in inaudible prayer. As she was saying rosary, so her lips were constantly moved in inaudible means that was not heard. Yes, she was beautiful. The author says, yes, she was beautiful. She was like the winter landscape in the mountains. Here, he describes his grandmother like she was like the landscape in the mountains, like a scenery and an expanse of pure white serenity, and an expanse, an area of pure white serenity, the state of being calm, breathing peace and contentment of happiness. Content means happiness. My grandmother and I were good friends. Here the author Khushwant Singh and his grandmother, they were very good friends. My parents left me with her when they went to live in the city, and we were constantly together. Constantly. They were always together. She used to wake me up in the morning and get me ready for school. She said her morning prayer in a monotonous sing-song while she bathed and dressed me in the hope that I would listen and get to know it by heart. So here she used to wake me in the sense the author the morning and get me ready for school. She said her morning prayer in a monotonous appeal. So in a pattern, in a rhythm, while she bathed and dressed him in the hope that he would listen and get to know it by heart, so that he could memorize, learn it, like how small kids used to memorize the rhymes and all by listening. So here grandma used to say morning prayer so that her grandson may listen and learn by heart. So here the author says, I listened because I loved her voice but never bothered to learn it. So here the author Khushwant Singh, he was fond of grandma's voice, but he never bothered, was not at all interested to learn the morning prayers which were said by his grandmother. Then she would fetch my wooden slate, which she had already washed and plastered with yellow chalk, a tiny earthen pot, and a red pen, tie them all in a bundle, and hand it to me. So, then she would fetch my wooden slate. Fetch in the sense she would bring his wooden slate which she had already washed, cleaned the slate and plastered with yellow chalk, attached with yellow chalk, a tiny earthen pot and a red pen, tied them all in a bundle and handed it to me. In the sense, she used to keep ready all his necessary things that he needed in the school. After a breakfast of a thick, stale chapati with a little butter and sugar spread on it, we went to school. After a breakfast, what they used to have a breakfast. So, they used to have a thick, stale chapati. Stale chapati means, here we see the chapati which is not fresh. The chapati which is not at all fresh. So, but good to eat. Hard chapati. So, with a little butter and sugar spread on it, we went to school. She carried several stale chapatis with her for the village dogs. So, after having breakfast, grandmother and the author, they used to go for school on the way. So, along with her, so here we see grandma, she used to carry several stale chapatis with her. For whom? For the village dogs. My grandmother always went to school with me because the school was attached to the temple. So, grandmother always, she used to go to school to leave her grandson because the school was attached to the temple. The priest taught us the alphabet and the morning prayer, while the children sat in rows on either side of the veranda singing the alphabet or the prayer in chorus. My grandmother sat inside reading the scriptures. So here we see the priest taught us the alphabet and the morning prayer. As the school was attached to the temple, the priest taught the children the alphabet and also the morning prayer. And the children sat in the rows on the other side of the veranda singing the alphabet or the prayer in the chorus in a rhythm. But what grandma used to do? She used to sit inside reading the scriptures. When we had both finished, we would walk back together. Okay, coming to school, going to school together and going to home together. This time the village dogs, while they were returning home, the time the village dogs would meet us at the temple door. They followed us to our home, growling and fighting with each other for the chapatis we threw to them. So when they used to go on the way to their house, they used to throw the chapatis, stale chapatis which they had brought to the dogs, village dogs. So these dogs were growling and fighting for the stale chapatis. When my parents were comfortably settled in the city, they sent for us. They called for us. Here, us refers to the author and the grandmother. That was a turning point in our friendship. Okay, this was a turning point, a great change in their friendship. Although we shared the same room, my grandmother no longer came to school with me. I used to go to an English school in a motor bus. So, when the author Kushwant Singh and his grandmother, when they went to city, the call of their parents, so here he says this was a turning point in their friendship. He says, although we shared the same room, they were living in the same room, both grandson and grandmother. My grandmother no longer came to school. So in the village, we have read children. Here the author the grandson and the grandmother used to go together to school, and together they used to return back to their house. But it was not the same thing in the city. My grandmother no longer came to school with me. I used to go to an English school in a motor bus. The bus used to pick him and drop him. There were no dogs in the streets, and she took to feeding sparrows in the courtyard of our city house. Okay, when she used to leave her grandson to school, she used to carry stale chapatis along with her for the village dogs. But here, as she is at home, okay, how she is spending her time, okay, as there were no dogs in the streets, she took to feeding sparrows in the courtyard. Courtyard means veranda of our city house, says the author Kushwant Singh. So children, I hope you have understood the prose, the first part of the prose, the portrait of a lady. The remaining part will continue in the next session. Watch this video many times until you understand. Thank you, children.